you so much for being here. It's really wonderful to have our wonderful panelists, and we're kicking our whole idea of webinar off with this first webinar on board diversity. This is more of an introductory kind of a webinar, and we're organizing it from the Leadership in Diversity Working Group. We're really, really glad and happy that all of you could join. And Chantal, over to you.
Thank you, Nikan. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here. And I'm excited to host this panel with these wonderful speakers. So as a quick introduction, we have Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, who is the founder and executive director of WCAPS. We have Essam Ghanim, who is the president of Search for Common Grounds, and Dylan Matthews, who's the chief executive at Peace Direct. And it is really a pleasure to share the same virtual stage with this esteemed group of panelists. I think we're going to have really great discussion, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot about kind of demystifying the board of directors. So to kick it off, I want to kind of just first highlight the different types of organizations that we have represented today. I think they're pretty different. And then also to just kind of point out that when you probably think about a member of the board of directors, you certainly might have a certain image in mind. But we're here to hopefully kind of talk about that as well. And so for me personally, I've served on two board positions. So one was a contemporary art gallery and independent movie theater. So that was an interesting experience. And then another one that I currently serve on is a nonprofit called the Good Energy Collective. And so I'm hoping that each of you can kind of give a brief description of the kind of boards that you are on, how long you've been on them, or if you can talk about your experience interacting with boards and in what capacity. We can start with Ambassador Jenkins.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you, Nikan. And I also want to thank Lindsay Rodman, who's not, her face isn't on the screen, but she also co-chairs with Nikan the working group that's putting together this webinar for Orgs in Solidarity. It's always great to be with you, Chantal and Dylan and Islam. It's just a wonderful, wonderful panel. So just very briefly, I have been on a lot of boards. I think I counted like 9 that I've been on. And obviously I like being on boards. And they've been on they've been different types. I have been on school boards for my high school. I've been on NGOs, boards of NGOs, and also research institutes. And I think for me, the real the differences, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this as we go further in depth into the conversation, is the way in which board of directors run their boards. And some, in my experience, are very much where you feel like you're part of the staff, where you're just meeting on a regular basis, and each one has a job and a task to do, to boards where you just hear from them once in a while. We're having a meeting this week, or we're having 2 meetings this year, and you hear from them right before. And there's just different styles, not only different types, as Chantal said, in terms of the type of organizations, but different styles. And I'm not going to say whether one is better than the other. I think it just depends on how the organization is run. I think the most important thing is that the organization itself is run well. And how boards are used depends very much on the board chair and on the executive director. So I'll just leave it at that to say, I've always enjoyed being on boards, different types of boards, different ways in which boards are used to help promote the organization. And I think I'll leave it at that, because I'm sure, Chantal, you'll have more questions later.
Thank you. Dylan, would you like to follow up, please?
Thanks, Chantel. So, yeah, I have been on a number of boards over the last 20 years. I first joined, my first board was in the year 2000, so 21 years ago now. Feels like a long time ago, but I think throughout that time, I have really, really benefited from board service. I can't say that 21 years ago I contributed much. I'm not sure in my 20s whether I knew enough to be able to contribute meaningfully, but I learned a lot. And I think that's one of the most important things, is that you don't always have to feel like you are there to contribute a lot. That people, I think, have this anxiety that, who am I to be able to have this set of skills to be able to support an organization? Actually, you can learn and develop and grow with the organizations as well. So currently, I'm the vice chair of the Alliance for Peacebuilding, a large peacebuilding network in the US, based in the US. I was previously the chair of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. I have been a member of the board at Peace Direct many years ago, before I became the chief exec. There was a many years gap between board service, but that's an interesting story about how being on the board can help really inspire you to then want to work for the organization. So I came back years later and joined as chief executive. I've also been a board member of a very small nonprofit working for a community development project in Uganda. So different types of organizations, all of which I think, you know, I had a passion for, and I think we all recognize that we need to have a passion for the cause that we're trying to support. But I suppose, just as an opener from my side, I think what I want to impress upon people is that how much I have grown as a person through my board service, and how it's helped me in my career, and how it's helped me connect to other people who have helped me in my career as well. So, of course, I hope that in board service, I have been able to contribute and to give back. But I have learned so much in that 20 years that it's really enriched my professional career.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. Issam.
Thank you, and I'm extremely happy to be with all of you. Also, my journey with board started exactly the year 2000, so we can exchange notes, but not as 8 or 9 like Ambassador Jenkins, so less than that. But primarily either as a member ex officio, because of my position in the board of major international organization in the development sector, you know, CARE, Child Fund, but also a member of the board of international entities like the board of Child Fund in India and the Raktai Foundation in Thailand. And I served for 1 year only the board member of a sport club, you know, in Sudan. So very diverse, and I would say whatever you put at the end of the day, you feel that you are getting more. You get more of, you know, self-fulfillment, access to network, relationships, connections. And I think that challenge that Dylan mentioned about, you always ask yourself the question whether I'm contributing enough or more. That's always a challenge with, I think, with any board assignment, I would say. Happy to share more, I think, as we continue. Thank you.
For sharing. That is really interesting. I think that the aspect of kind of sometimes just going in and learning is really key. I think that was definitely my first experience. But this definitely leads nicely into my next question, which is about you know, kind of going into more depth about your experiences. I think we'd all be really interested to hear, you know, sort of what was rewarding and what was really frustrating. Sort of just general takeaways and lessons learned would be really, really exciting to hear about. So let's go in the opposite direction. Issam, would you like to start?
Sure. I think generally experience, I would say, very positive. First of all, sometimes you underestimate the sense of fulfillment you get from contributing to a mission. exercising that duty of care without getting compensated for it, learning definitely a lot, building relationships, and also always you end up getting access to networks outside your professional domain, which I think is a big advantage. What I found also very fulfilling and positive, from time to time, depending on the board, an organization or an entity may face certain situations that you feel that you have the skill and the competencies to provide that situational leadership and help resolve it or contribute to it. That's always is very good. And then personally, you grow in terms of mastering that art of persuasion, I think, in the boardroom, etc. So I think you really get almost 360 degree, really positive contributions to you personally, from learning, from relating, from contributing to resolving certain aspects or issues, and I think I would say, reflecting back on those, I don't know how you feel, Dylan, Ambassador, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the relationships you build, even if they are for a short period of time, for some reason they tend to stay. And there is something about that boardroom that when you develop a relationship, even just for 1 year or 2 years, it seems that you end up in that relationship will stay with you. And even if you get disconnected for like 10 years, in one example I had, it's very easy to reconnect back and click very quickly. So definitely there is an affinity, a sense of affinity that you develop being part of these boards, but definitely not all boards affairs are usually smooth. Sometimes you get into very highly charged situations that either break people or bring them together. So yeah.
Yes, maybe we'll get more into what's those highly charged situations. Bonnie, would you care to go next?
Okay, I was gonna give it over to Dylan, but okay, yeah, I'm happy to chat. Just, I mean, I can only really reiterate a lot of what's been said. I mean, I have found them boards to be enjoyable. I don't have any negative experiences that I can share with anyone. I've always enjoyed them. The camaraderie is great. You get to know people. You see them on a regular basis. Some more often than others, but you have a shared mission and a shared goal, and so that, in a sense, it's a combining feature. Is that you're all there because you believe in the mission of the organization, and so I think that it makes you enjoy the experience even more, because you're not only enjoying doing something for the organization, you enjoy being with other people who also care about the organization and want to do something to promote its work. So the camaraderie is there, the mission there, meeting people who may be different from yourself is there. And then, of course, in boards, they very often, there's specific jobs that board members have, committees. So, and that's another way to get even more involved and more engaged and enjoy it, because you get to work on specific issues. And sometimes it's issues that you may not know that much about, so very often I'll be asked to be on a committee on something I had actually no expertise. But, then you learn from the experience, and you're learning in a safe environment where you're not going to be judged by, oh my God, you screwed this up. It's like, look, I'm telling you right now, I don't know anything about this. But you learn in the process, and you can be with others who really understand, and you understand all the intricacies of running an organization, and which I appreciate, having been on boards, is you learn the good, all of the positives and negatives that you have to deal with in running an organization, but all because you want to promote the goals of the work. So you have to deal with the financial issues, you have to deal with the HR issues, you have to deal with the tax issues, you have to deal with these things, but that's part of running an organization. And some things are the executive director's job, and then some things are the board's job. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, Dylan, take it away.
Thanks, Chantal. So I agree wholeheartedly with what Bonnie and Issam said, so I won't repeat those things. I just support them all. I'll add two things to that. One is you never know where it will lead you. And I think the two stories, the two examples I'd like to give, one of which, as I said, I was a board member on the Peace Direct board when Peace Direct was a very young organization back in 2006. Fell in love with the organization and really got to understand the organization. So when the opportunity came, when there was a vacancy for the chief executive position in 2015, I took it. I applied. So you find you can really fall in love with an organization and it becomes part of your life. So that happened to me at Peace Direct. Another example would be at Alliance for Peacebuilding. I joined as a board member 3 years ago. And 2 years later, I was asked to be the chair of the board. And that gave me a whole new perspective on how to support an organization and how to work with the chief executive to really build a dynamic network of peace-building organizations. So you might join for certain reasons, to learn, to network, but you never know where it will lead you. The second thing is it really does help provide, I think, the sort of 30,000-foot view of the organization. So Issam talked about the 360-degree view, which I think is absolutely right. You learn parts about an organization that you would never otherwise know, and potentially don't have much experience in. So whether it's audits or whatever it might be, but actually also the 30,000-foot view, you start to hone your skills in thinking about the strategy of an organization, and you learn and you develop your strategic thinking, because a board is there really most of the time. The board is there to help with the strategy. It's not to help to run an organization in the day-to-day sense, because you have staff. Now, of course, Bonnie mentioned that there are cases, particularly when they're smaller organizations, where you really roll up your sleeves and you get stuck in. As an organization grows and matures, you usually tend to get the executive, the staff that run the organization on a day-to-day level, and then the board help on the strategic and governance side. And I do think that strategic and governance perspective is very, I think, really, really interesting and really valuable. I'll leave it at that, but maybe I wonder, I'm going to preempt your next question, which is about the disadvantage or the cons, the things that aren't so good, or frustrations around being on a board. Because I do think that I wouldn't want to paint this wonderful rosy picture of what it's like to be on boards. It is fantastic. It's rewarding. It's exciting. It really does help with your professional development and personal development. But there are aspects to being on the board that are difficult and challenging and frustrating. And so I'd just like to share a couple of those, if that's okay. The first is, I think, the dirty secret that board members don't like talking about, which is, folks, that sometimes it can be a bit boring. Being on a board isn't always exciting. And I hate to say that, because I think that people think of these boards being quite an exciting strategic fora, but actually sometimes you have passion for a cause. You join an organization, and then the next thing you find yourself on a committee discussing fiduciary risk, or the latest audit, or something that is so out of your comfort zone or your interest. Now, that's part of being on a board. I think you learn there will be parts of the role that aren't that exciting, but it's part of your responsibility. So it isn't, I think people have to remember that a board is there to serve a particular function and not to just keep you entertained. And so some of those things you just have to step up and do. And that also leads me to the second point, which is it can take up a lot more time than you think. So I have been on boards where, and it's just happened at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, where the chief executive will step down, and suddenly you find yourself then having to be involved in recruitment processes and much more involved pieces of work, which take up a lot of time. They are themselves rewarding and challenging, and they stretch you, but don't underestimate the time that you might need when you're being on a board. Sometimes when it's smooth, they might not need you that often. When things get tough, you might be pulled in every week, or potentially much more than that. You might actually need to help work with the staff. And the third thing I wanted to say, the challenge, I think, is that people who join boards are so passionate about the causes that sometimes the boundaries between what a board does and what staff does can be blurred. Now, in small startup organizations, that's not too much of a problem. As Bonnie mentioned, sometimes everyone chips in and they all roll up their sleeves and get going. But actually, it can be problematic if there isn't if the boundaries between what the board decide and what the executive decide isn't clear, because you then start to get conflicts about who makes the decision. And that can be even more problematic if then there's a clash between the executive and the board. So those are frustrations, and I've seen those frustrations in previous boards where, you know, these really enthusiastic board members want to do more, but don't know whether or not how to apply that, because there are staff who are supposed to then get on with the job, and sometimes they won't necessarily listen to the board, because the board is there sometimes to act as an advisor, not necessarily to make every single decision. So those are some of the frustrations, but of course those frustrations pale into insignificance compared to what you gain from being on a board.
Generally a really positive experience. Yeah. Does anyone else want to share some thoughts on frustrations? Which also might lead into the next question about, I mean, it sounds like I know the answer to this, but generally, you know, would you encourage others to do it, to serve on boards, to kind of just take that leap if given the opportunity? And then we'll talk about how to seek that opportunity, but yeah, what are the thoughts?
Well, I totally agree with everything Dylan says. I really have nothing to add because I think Dylan's captured it. And I've had the privilege of being on the Alliance for Peace Building board, which is one of the ones I had to actually leave because of my nomination for going into the State Department. But you know, one thing I don't have is the experience of running a board, because I think that'll give even more perspective, which I think Dylan has giving us some things to think about. But I would say, I mean, obviously I'll be positive since I've been on so many of them. So you can probably figure, I'll say the answer is yes, I think it's worthwhile. I think it's, I mean, for all the reasons that we already said, you know, if these are things that interest you, if you are interested, if there's an organization out there that you really believe in the organization, their work, you believe in the cause in which they are pursuing, I would say in our community of people on this call, and you know, the ones we work with are obviously are people who are driven by a cause, a public service. So I think that's everyone here would benefit from being, at least having an experience of being on a board. I think, you know, whether you want to experience the different parts of an organization, it's just good to learn. It's good to learn what the inside scoop of how you run an organization. And you may not get on a board, you may not get the perspective of the person who's running it every day, but you will certainly get the experience and the perspective of an organization. And depending on how engaged the board.
No, Bonnie.
You're on mute. You went on mute.
Sorry. I guess I'll go back a little bit and say, yeah, you may not get, and hope I'm not repeating too much, you may not get on a board, you may not get the everyday experience that you would if you're running an organization, but you still get some ideas of what it's like to be on an organization, and how it's run, and what happens on the background, which may be of interest to you. I also think that organizations really will benefit from having people with diverse views on it. You know, I really think so. I mean, all of these issues that we've been talking about today, the work that all of you do in your organizations, and the whole purpose of what we do at WCAPS and Orgs in Solidarity is about the importance of different views, different cultures, different perspectives. And I think we all owe it to ourselves to ensure that organizations get that viewpoint, not just in terms of the hiring part of it, but the board perspective. And I think very often you will hear people say, I mean, when I worked at the Ford Foundation and we gave grants, one of the first questions we always asked was, tell us about your board. Who's on your board? What's the demographics of your board? Because we wanted to know, you know, it's a reflection of the organization. And today, with the call for diversity and equity and inclusion that you're hearing everywhere, boards are a place where people are looking to see what, it's a reflection, of the organization itself. I mean, you have the entities within the organization, but the board is really looked at, okay, what does your board look like? And if we don't see diversity at the board level, then there's a lot of questions that come up about how much change are you really ready for? How much do you really want to diversify the perspectives of your entire organization? And so I think we should be, with different views and different perspectives, I think we should be ready to take that step to be on a board, and I'm certainly recommending people to be on boards, particularly people of color and other diversities to be on boards to help ensure that organizations are in fact going to be moving in a direction that is diverse and equitable and inclusive. So I think I'll leave it at that.
And for me, I think just to recognize that also, boards are very different. I was in $700 million organization. The board functions differently than when you are in a $20, $50 million, and it's totally different than a sport club that is $1 million. So definitely we have to acknowledge that there are very diverse cultures, diverse frustration that come with these types. Usually boards of large organizations tend to be very bureaucratic. Everything is bylaws and everything, there are boundaries around it, and etc., etc. But I think I found generally there are very common threads among all of them. In addition, you mentioned about what you get. All of them, come with certain level of accountability, professional and moral accountability as a board member. So you can forget that you are accountable, and given that, then there is going to be always competition for your time and effort. If you are not a very busy person, and there are very few people who are not, then you will feel that pressure from time to time. Exactly, if that question that Dylan mentioned in your head, am I contributing enough? Am I doing enough? And that, I think, always create competition for time. And if time is very short for you, I think you will get frustrated sometimes about that. I found that also from time to time, you may be really a subject matter expert in a certain area, and it may come up in the board, but you will not have the chance to have that deep dive, just because sometimes of the division between the governance and management or staff that I think was mentioned, and you have really to manage and safeguard that boundary extremely well to avoid having any confusion. Some of them, my experiences indicate that also usually the tension in the board in many cases comes when there are financial issues. As I continue to say, when there is no finance in the board, there is no romance in the board. So, and in addition of the tension, what I found when you get into a crisis like that, usually there will be significant emphasis on the board giving, because the board giving is important. And when you have board members that are very diverse, they will not have the same depth of pocket. And you end up with people contributing little, but you end up with people contributing millions. And sometimes that creates some sort of a very interesting dynamic that if you are a chairperson or you are an active board member, you need to manage that extremely well. You don't want some of the members to function with a sense of deficiency, and you don't want also some of the board members to function with a sense of entitlement because of the way they contribute. And I think managing these two is very subtle, and sometimes you miss it, but that creates sometimes some level of frustration, I think, among that. My experience with non-profit, and I don't know how Ambassador Jenkins and Daniel, you have a lot of experience in that. I found that generally, you will feel satisfied with how the board fulfill its fiduciary and strategic functions, usually audit, finance, approvals, of strategic plan, etc. But usually, for some reason, the non-profit board are weak in the generative functions. The generative function of being part of a dialogue, part of a discourse in the organization, to shape up an initiative, to shape up some sort of a strategic positioning of the organization, to help generatively in terms of providing ideas to how to globalize or internationalize, etc. This function, although seems to be very logical, usually they are very weak in the non-profit board. And I thought a lot about this. I found that sometimes there is a tendency of the non-profit board to mimic the corporate board functions, how banks and big, investment, companies are structured and they work. And by doing that, frankly, they lose the sense that Ambassador Jenkins mentioned. I think that this is about the mission, this is about the relationship, this is about collaborating, not just because of your pocket, but because of your ideas and then how you can. Personally, I found that the most valuable support I got when I am a staff member is those board members that help me with networking, those board members that help me with connecting and positioning. Definitely, just like those also who can provide a lot of money. And sometimes these functions, they don't get the same weight. As I mentioned, especially in your financial crisis or difficulty, the tendency to focus on those who can give more money, recruit those who can give more money. And suddenly 2 years down the road, you end up with people who are very rich, but they may not have that emotional connection with the mission. And even if they have the emotional connection with the mission, as I mentioned, there is that subtle feeling and sense of either deficiency or entitlement. If you don't manage it in the boardroom, it may affect basically the level of satisfaction that people basically mention. And the last point, which I think very germane to the to the discussion here, I found that diversity in terms of changing the composition of the board is not that complicated. You can do it. However, managing that diversity of your board in order really to harvest the business benefits that come with diversity is a challenge. And we can talk more about that, later on. But that's, I think, some of the observations that sometimes create some frustration in boardrooms. Yeah.
Thank you for those comments. The conversation about finances and money matter really made me think about my time on the board at the art gallery, because there is certainly a difference in the members' contribution of mine compared to everyone else who are very well-established people. And it was a little bit strange that I was brought on, and I think that they recognized that times were changing in Santa Fe, and then they needed to kind of change up the look and feel of the organization. And so it was definitely a strategic decision to bring me on, not only because I'm a Black and Filipino woman, but also because I worked at Los Alamos National Lab at the time, which is an organization that they had not previously had much interaction with, but also one that had a lot of money. But the idea of, just how I was even, kind of targeted or asked to be on the board, it was through a friend. She was serving on the board and, asked me to join. And the current organization I'm on now also, because I know the co-founder of the organization, and they were very intentional and asked me as well. So there was no public listing or public posting about it. And so I was wondering if each of you could talk about, what brought you onto the various boards, and maybe talk about that experience for some of the audience members as well. Dylan, why don't you go first, please?
Thanks, Chantal. I think you raise a very interesting point about how people join boards, and whether or not the way in which most people join boards limits the opportunities of others. And I think that, if I look at my own history of board service, the majority of the boards that I have joined have been because I have been invited by either the chief executive or the president of the organization. So it's very much a proactive outreach to the people that they want on their boards. Now, that is one route, and it's a very well-established route to get people on the board. The problem with that is that it doesn't really enable others. We've had, someone in the chat box that said, "How do we get onto a board? How is it possible if I don't know the right people? How do you do it?" And there is a risk, I think, with the current system where it's contacts, it's who you know, and so but usually in most boards you have a mix. You have the proactive outreach as well as the advertising, and I would always encourage people, if they find an organization that they care about and they would like to do board service, to actually be proactive, to approach those organizations. I am the chief executive of an organization, Peace Direct, based in the UK and in Washington, DC. And we have advertised, and we've got some fantastic people. We have also gone out proactively to find people, and we have received unsolicited applications. I remember 2 years ago where someone said, my New Year's resolution was to pluck up the courage to contact you because I really would love to join your board. And we were so taken by the letter, we invited him onto the board. Now, we weren't even looking for there were board vacancies, but we weren't proactively looking. So I think that you can do that, and that is a route. It is a more unconventional route, but it is possible. The other thing I should say is, and I mentioned this in the chat box, is that there's another route to board service, which I do encourage the people on who are listening to this to think about, which is, don't necessarily think about the board as the first option. Look at the committees that might have been set up by boards. So I'm on a diversity, equity, and inclusion working group or committee for the Peace and Security Funders Group. The Peace and Security Funders Group is a collection of mostly US-based funders operating in this space, and they were looking for people to support their commitment to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. So they wanted a group of people to help them do that. So I find being on that committee and that working group immensely rewarding, and I'm learning a lot, and I know I'm helping the Peace and Security Funders Group grow in its thinking. And that is not a board membership in the traditional sense. I have no role in terms of the governance. It's an advisory, like a brain trust for the group. But that can also, so that in itself is rewarding, and it can lead to board service. So sometimes I think we think about just the narrow focus around board service, but there are other ways in which you can support the governance and functioning of an organization through these committees, which actually can be very interesting because they're more focused on a particular area of work. So it could be a programs committee, it could be a policy and advocacy committee, it could be a fundraising committee, but those might also tap into a specific skill set that you have. And enable you to then give more of your time to that particular group. So I would also encourage that.
Thank you. Bonnie, would you like to add to that?
Yes, now just actually answering something in the chat. Like Dylan, every single board I've been on, I've been asked to be on. So there is certainly, as he said, I mean, that I think for the most part, that tends to be how it's done. There are companies, if you want to be on, because every board I've been on, I was not paid. But if you wanted to be on a paid board, there are companies that are out there where you can actually try to be on a paid board. Not how I would do it, but the option is out there. If that's what you're interested in. but as Dylan said, you know, the other way for a lot of nonprofits is being asked. And so I think a lot has to be, if we're talking about diversifying boards, which is one of the reasons why we're here, you know, just picking up to what I said before, you know, doing some diligence on your own part and helping to help diversify the boards. I just recently had a colleague of mine, an African-American man, join a board. He was interested. He said, Bonnie, you know, I want to join a board. I'm ready to join a board. So I said, well, I know of an organization that's looking for a board member. And he applied and he got the job. I mean, job, quote unquote, it's not getting paid, but you know what I mean? He's on the board. So I think, you know, you have to look out for to help to make sure that, since, as Dylan said, in my experience, the process is one that's very much who you know, like so many other things, who you know, which is why things are not very diverse in general. Then, you know, take it upon oneself to say, well, I know, I mean, you know, in answer to the question about, you know, I want to diversify, I mean, we have, you know, uh-oh, did I lose you? Okay. You disappeared for a second. Anyway, you know, WCAPS has over 1,400 women of color, you know, who are experts in all types of fields. You know, so there are people out there who can be on boards. You know, if you really want to find a diverse person, you know, one way to start is to talk to us. You know, I mean, we have a lot. We have a lot of expertise. And so I think it's tapping into networks to get around the just, I know one person, where can I go? And it's the same thing with so many other things with diversity and challenges, where people say, I don't know anyone. There are people who just don't know where to go. You know, and one of the reasons why I established WCAPS is for that reason, so that people know there are people out there who can be on boards. You just have to tap into the networks that exist. So certainly, you know, we have people to try to get around the who you know, because that is, as Dylan said, that's pretty much how I've been joining boards.
I would say that, you know, that's the good news and the bad news. The bad news is that, let us acknowledge that, yes, there is barrier to entry, which is basically the traditional recruitment practices in boards, irrespective, large or small, because of the relational imperative, focus on invitation. You invite who you know, and then you end up with a certain group of people circulating around this board. You create a lot of pressure on them on one side, but at the same time, it really limits the entry to this kind of function or club. But I would say that that practice is changing gradually. It is changing gradually because I think in the majority of cases, boards now are not entirely fixated on only those who have deep pockets, those who can provide a lot of millions of dollars to the organization. And I think in the majority of cases, and thanks to quite a number of agencies and companies that are shaping mind, there is realization that a board need to have a competency matrix that will show what they have, what they don't have, given basically their mission and their priorities. And then the recruitment process is going to be tailor-made in order to bring people, that fit that particular competency. Just like Chantel, maybe they saw certain competency on you, and that is very valuable, and you have to bring people like that. But I think what both Dylan and Ambassador Enki mentioned, it's very important to reach a certain level of profile. And I have no idea how to advise people to do this. You need to have a certain level of profile so that you are at least visible. If you are not visible, then it's going to be very problematic, frankly, to recruit you to boards. And the question is how to create that visibility for you. Sometimes you become proactive. I had the same experience Dylan mentioned of someone who is not even our radar screen, wrote a very powerful letter about our sector, about our mission, our organization, about the association with that particular part of job, and presented basically the value addition she can bring to the board. It took us 1 or 2 years, but finally she ended up in the board and made significant contribution, frankly, to the board functions and credibility, etc., etc. There are quite a number of agencies and companies that started really to manage the recruitment process, because whatever you do in terms of the traditional practice of invitation, you will have some sort of biases. There is courtesy bias sometimes, there is a relationship bias sometimes, there is professional bias sometimes. And in order really to navigate through all these biases, some boards now are hiring companies that are neutral, that they help them to identify what they need, and then they manage the recruitment process. Because without these biases, always are going to be barriers to entry into this domain of being part of board and contributing to that. Not an easy thing to resolve, but I think there is movement in the right direction.
I think that's a start, certainly. And I think a good takeaway from this conversation in particular is to certainly be an advocate for yourself. I think that's hard, but maybe it takes practice. I have more questions, but I definitely want to give the audience time to ask questions as well in the last couple minutes here. And I know that there were some in the chats, and I have not been monitoring, but yeah, if there are questions from the audience, if not, I can follow up with some others. But Nakan, do you?
So some of the questions I think Dylan already answered. And well, if the audience has some, they can put in right now, and then we can read it out. Maybe we can give them like 1-2 minutes. Yeah.
There's one that maybe we could respond to, which is from Isabel G. She says, she's asked a number of questions. One is, how do you create the board? How do you ask people to join? But then she says, as a startup, can you ask for board members to provide financial contributions? If so, how do you assess how much? And I think Isam talked about this. I think the short answer is, I think you can and you should. I mean, it's interesting. I'm based in the UK. Here, there's no expectation that board members give financially. In fact, it's frowned upon. It's felt maybe it's a very un-British thing. You just don't ask people to give to the organization if you serve on it. I actually really like the US approach, which is you give your time, you treasure your talent, you give to the organization that you care for. The problem that Isam mentioned so articulately was that in doing so, what you end up having is you have those who give generously, and you can set, a minimum board contribution of a certain amount. But what does that mean in terms of diversity of board members? There's a real risk that you then have, as Isam mentioned, a group of wealthy, highly undiverse people on your board, and if you do have people on your board who can't afford it, then it sets up a difficult, challenging dynamic, as Isam mentioned, about how you navigate the tensions that brings. So I think the simple answer to Isabel's question is yes, you can and you should. You can ask. And you need that board buy-in from the chair of the board all the way across the whole board to be able to do that, because for those boards who haven't asked before, it is a big step. But be aware of the pitfalls in doing that. Be aware that in doing so, you might become a less diverse organization. And to avoid that, you might need to have differences in a different approach to ensure that diversity. But in doing that, you also then will set up potential tensions that you just have to be aware of. Now, it's possible to navigate through those, and it's important to navigate through those because you absolutely want a more diverse board. But the financial contribution piece is very tricky, or can be.
I think one step in the right direction. I remember a few years ago, usually we'll have one common expectations or role of board of directors, and that will be shared widely. I started to see that some of the board that are really looking to address this issue as well as diversify in the true sense, they started to have very individualized expectations. Because if you have a matrix, you may recruit people that you are recruiting them because of their pocket. And therefore the expectation is that they provide minimum, that what they will give and take, a minimum amount of contributions. You can segment it based on their giving capacity. But that is very reasonable, and that is very logical expectation to share in an individualized way. You may individualize it to another person that, look, I'm recruiting you because we cannot function effectively unless we have an inroad, for example, to the diplomatic circles. And therefore, what we need in terms of expectation is for you to help us with networking, is how really to upgrade the diplomatic skills of the chief or the staff, and how to connect us with centers of influence and network. And frankly, the financial contribution would be very secondary to that. So I think this approach of having individualized expectation, I think is a step in the right direction. But it works on the other way around to avoid that uncomfortable feeling. When you are recruited or you are invited to the board, you have to be clear about what are the individualized expectations about you, rather than what is the generic basically expectation about the board member. If you clarify that from the beginning, you will, solve yourself a lot of issues and problems in the future. Yeah.
Chantal, I think we have 2 more questions. Can you see the chat? Can you?
Yes, I can. Thank you. So let's see, or 3 questions maybe. So one, intentionally open-ended. How do you know if a board is working well? Maybe I'll just run through the questions. This is 2 minutes left, and I'll let you all decide what you want to answer. Do you feel that it is felt to be tokenistic to recruit specifically to achieving a more diverse board as compared to identifying this critical set of skills, maybe that Isam was mentioning, and look for diverse members that maybe fill those skill sets. And then I wonder if funders are going beyond looking at just the diversity of an organization's board, but asking whether the board is taking steps to ensure true inclusiveness and whether they're providing support for new board members. This is the comment. But yes. All right. Sorry. Take the floor.
I'll take a quick stab, because I see we don't have much time. For Lynn, I would say, I don't think it's an either or. I think you can look for skills and also look for a diverse person who has those skills. I think that it's helpful if the existing board members say, we really do need to be much more diverse. We are going to, for this next slot that's open, we're going to really push and do everything we can to hire a person who's diverse, and who has some of the skills that we want to have. Because like I said, not that my organization is the be all end all for everything, but we have, and it's just an example, there's women and others in the organization and allies who have a lot of skills in a lot of things, and they're all majority women of color. So you can have it both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. You can say we really want to hire a diverse person who has these skills. And I think that's a good way of trying to do it. I have some thoughts on the other ones, but we're running out of time, so I'll just pass it off to my colleagues.
I can quickly answer the question around how do you know if a board is performing well. I think one of the most standard tools is just a self-evaluation. So boards evaluate themselves, and there are checklists that are in abundance now, because there are, the nonprofit world is such a dynamic and significant part of the sector. So I think that for those boards, board members who want to know more, there are checklists and templates that help you ask the right questions. And again, as long as the board have bought into this, I think it's a very important practice, because the board, you know, you acquire these skills, right? You don't come with all the skills to be a fantastic board. So it's important that you critically reflect on your own performance, because a good board can make or break an organization. So those self-assessments are very, very important.
Last thing to answer Jeff questions, I think they are very good. I would say some donors, but especially in corporations or foundation, may go beyond just who's in your board and what is the composition of the board. So it's very limited, but it started really for people to understand there is a checklist whether the board is doing 1, 2, 3, 4 or not. That I think they attempt to make sure that some of the donors, but it's not wide, and I don't think that it is existing in the government regulations, you know, per se. So definitely, I think that's a very important, you know, important area for it.
And I know you're going to end soon. There is one, and Nikon, you may. I don't want to steal your thunder about the fall, so I won't. But if you don't say it, I will, because I saw Lindsay put something in there. I'll turn it over back to you, Chantal. We'll see.
All right. Yes. We can talk about this again, and yes, we'll inform you on that. But I want to thank you all for joining this panel. This is a really, really fascinating discussion, and I think it really kicks off this new series in a really great way. I think it left us with a lot of good questions and more things to talk about. So thank you again. I really appreciate this conversation.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Wait, before we go.
Thank you so much, Dylan, Chantal, Bonnie, and Isam. I think it was brilliant, it was eye-opening, and it was a very healthy conversation even through the chat. But also thank you, Bonnie, for not stealing my thunder. So the announcement that Lindsay and I wanted to make together was, but I'm here, so I'm making it, is that we are kind of preparing for a boards fair, which will be happening, and there will be more webinars that we are going to arrange. This is the first of the many. I mean, some definitely, and it's a process that we're leading towards the boards fair. It's something different. It's something innovative. It's not something we've really heard ourselves. So definitely very, very excited for it, and just wanted to throw in the idea so that everybody keeps it on their minds and comes attends it when it happens. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good to meet you.
Lynn, it'll be this. Lynn's asking when. It'll be this fall.
Okay. Great. Fantastic. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Meet you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.